Now you can make these racks any length you like, but I think that probably the most useful size is the 300mm, so one of the long ones with one each of the terminals, and then another one using one long rack and one short rack with a terminal at each end. So that comes in at about 450mm. The 500mm one is pretty long, and I think if you saw my weight test video, you can see that actually it's right at the edge of what the poor little box can manage. The other thing that is very handy is to print off this little guide box. And the guide box is there so that you can put the rail into it, and then when it's joined up together you can be sure that the teeth fit precisely. So it's a very good idea not to glue the things together until you're sure that that spacing is good. There you go, you can see that that's not fitting properly at all there. You've really just got to make sure that it all sits nicely into the guide box. That's what this thing is all about. It really is worth spending just a little bit of time to get this right. It will just make the rack move more smoothly through the winder. Make sure you don't overdo it. You can twist the pieces together to see if they're lining up, and the backs should be even. And what you mustn't do is to file it back so far that you just lose the connection between the two faces. That's really important. So take it a tiny bit at a time, just file it gently away, twist it, get it into position, just get it as good as you can make it and as straight as possible. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of possible elephant's footing on the sides as well, on this bottom area. That's where the first layer of the print just slightly bulges outwards, and I'm not enough of an expert at 3D printing to get it absolutely perfect. If you just take that down a little bit, it means it all fits nicely into the guide box and will sit properly together. So let's just do that one as well. There we go. And then we put it into the guide box again and get that as close as we can get it. There you go, that's looking pretty good now. I think that's acceptable. Now, I don't want to be giving advice that risks messing things up for you, so if you're not particularly confident with the plastic weld, just glue the dowel or the hollow joiner piece into one side and then just slot it into the other. You can always put the plastic weld on afterwards and let the capillary action suck the solvent in, and I think we're going to do that. We're going to do that anyway after we have put the threaded rod through. So if you're not too sure about that, just put it on one side. The joining pieces fit very firmly in, but I like to add some of my plastic weld before putting them in. Get that in solidly, and then put some more around the edge to make a really solid fit there. That's it. Then when you put the other one on, the other end on, put a little bit inside. That just softens the plastic. Put it on. That's when you put the guide box on. It's only once you get the threaded rod through them that they really get their strength. So be very careful once you've just made them up, and get those rods in as soon as you can. So the first job is to cut the M6 threaded rod to length. For the short module, that is 295mm. For the medium one, that's with the long module and the short module combined, that's 430, and for the extra long one, that's with the 2 long modules, it's 495. So make sure that any overhanging sharp little burrs are taken off the threaded rod with a file or a grinder or something. What you don't want is for the metal to gouge its way through the plastic. So the next job is to mark on the rod the position where it is just before it enters the joint, right up the far end, just so that you've got a bit of an indicator. So what I do is take it back from the joint about 10, 12 mils, something like that. Don't forget there's that little insert in there, maybe a little bit more. And you can mark it with a Sharpie, that's fine. But actually much better than that is a piece of tape. That will remind you. You won't forget that as it's spinning round. And that will tell you when you've reached that point that the rod is about to enter the joint at that end. Starting at the end with the M6 hole, the first job is to put the rack into the guide box with the first joint halfway along it, and then put that into the vise and hold it firmly. Now you put a little tiny smear of Vaseline along the length of the thread. This just helps to lubricate it as it's going in. It won't squeak nearly as much. And then put a drill onto the end. You can do it with a hand drill, you can do it with an electric drill. Slow speed. When you get to the point where the little bit of tape is approaching the end, stop, release your drill, then take the whole thing out of the vise, and now what you're going to do is swap over the guide box from this joint to the joint at the other end. So I'm just going to put that into position again, like the other one. What this does is just to prevent any stress from going onto that joint while the threaded rod is going through it. So then remove the tape. Set up with the drill again. And this time you're going to feel it come to the end stop. And the drill should slip, the drill chuck should slip against the threaded rod. So you shouldn't do any harm, but just take it very gently as you go. You should be able to feel it. There it is. The resistance just gets stronger, so be prepared to stop immediately when that is done. And you'll find that it is remarkably rigid all of a sudden, nice and strong. So the last thing I like to do is to put a nut onto the end of it. To be honest, the nut doesn't really hold the whole thing together. It's the thread that's cut inside the plastic that holds it together. So I'm just using an M6 nylock, but anything similar will be just fine. Now these joints are pretty good and rigid, but I like the belt and braces approach, so just flooding a little bit more plastic weld into those joints. Let's do this end. That's it. Just take a fine file and just go over those edges just to make sure that's nice and smooth. When it runs through the winder box, it's not going to catch anywhere. Same that end. And that should be that. Oh, just make sure that the bottom is flat. If there's any unevenness there, that needs to come off as well. So just file that smooth. Maybe take a little bit of fine emery paper to it just to rub it smooth. So the final task is just to sort out the end fitting. So that can be just a plain piece of K&S going in the end, or a ball stem, so with a 6mm ball joint on it, and then that's ready to join up to your puppet in whatever fashion you want. There's a little captive nut that goes into the end of the rack, and don't forget the locking nut which goes on the end. That's very important, otherwise the whole thing will start to rotate if you don't tighten that up. Well, if you've got this far, thank you very much for your patience. And here's a little free gift for you. This is a bracket that I designed to fit onto the winder, just to support it so you can do all sorts of other things with it. And there's a little bar that goes with it, and that just screws into those holes on the back end of the winder. There are 5mm and 6mm holes in the bracket, and it can be adjusted up and down, and of course you can then move whatever you want on set. Don't forget, it doesn't have to be the puppet moving. It can be all sorts of things that just need that tiny bit of adjustment, so you can fix this down and adjust it. You can find this on My Mini Factory as a bracket for DIYnder. There's a link down below, and it's a free download. Thank you very much for watching. Here's a final tip for you. For most of the construction I've been using M3 posi head bolts, but I used some of these ones here which are hex head, and they're rather good because they've got some knurling on the side, and they're much easier to use when you're just adjusting with your fingers.